What's up guys, Michael Corsentino here with my August 2018 lighting tutorial for BehindTheShutter.com and Shutter Magazine. This month it's my top 10 lighting mistakes. So I want to start off first of all by saying that these are 10 mistakes that I have made myself many times. These are mistakes that newcomers to lighting will make, and these are mistakes that seasoned pros will make. But I think that they are fairly common enough that they're worth putting together this top 10 list for. And again, no judgments here with mistakes. I think that mistakes are where you learn the most, and you should never be afraid to fail and make mistakes. But hopefully this top 10 list will save you a little legwork and you'll be able to learn from some of my mistakes. So let's dig right in. All right, so first on our list of flash mistakes is not using off-camera flash. Guys, flash off-camera is so easy these days with wireless flash and TTL. There's no excuse for not getting your strobe, your hot shoe flash off your camera. It's going to give you all sorts of creative options. It's going to allow you to introduce direction, which we're going to talk about more later. It's going to allow you to use a whole assortment of modifiers that you will not have access to if your flash is on your camera. And most importantly, it's going to create really sophisticated, compelling images that are going to be lit way better than if you have your flash sitting in your hot shoe on your camera, where what happens is you end up creating lighting that is very flat and one-dimensional, lighting that is very bright in the foreground and very dark in the background because of the way the exposure is handled. So that's the first mistake, is not getting your flash off camera. So if you're not using off-camera flash, otherwise known as OCF, I recommend that you do it. It does take a little bit more effort. You might have to have an assistant holding a light stand or a light stand, a portable light stand, to put a light, off your camera, but it is well worth the effort. So that is mistake number one. Mistake number two is always using your modifiers in exactly the same way. I think this is something that we can all fall into. It's easy to get into a rut with your lighting modifiers, but the thing to realize is that every modifier, even the most rudimentary modifier, like a softbox, for example, has diffusion fabric on the outside, and a diffusion baffle, an interior diffusion baffle on the inside. It has various interior fabrics that you can use, like silver or white. You can try them in all sorts of different variations and combinations thereof. In other words, you can use them with all the diffusion, you can use it with some of the diffusion, you can use it with none of the diffusion, you can play with the direction, you can play with the angle, you can play with the distance. There are myriad ways that you can use one modifier to create all sorts of different looks and effects. I did a whole article on this where I used a convertible umbrella, the one you're looking at here, an 8-in-1 umbrella, to show you just how many different ways you can use one modifier to create all sorts of different looks. Then it gets even more interesting when you add in things like egg crate grids or grid spots in the case of reflectors. So you just have a ton of options. So I know it's really easy when you have only a handful of modifiers or maybe one modifier to think that you're very limited in what you can do, but I encourage you to really push outside your comfort zone and try different things, use the modifier differently than you have been, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Number 3 in our top 10 list of lighting mistakes would be not feathering, and this ties perfectly into our last mistake because we're talking again about softboxes. Softboxes have a hot spot in their center, and sometimes that's what you want, but I would tell you if you're looking for soft light, it's really not ideal. The best way to get soft light is to feather your light. So what that means is that you work with the light coming out of the back edge of the softbox. Okay, so if we look at these 3 images in this slide, you'll see here that over on the left, the image is not, the light rather, is not feathered. All right, so what that means is that the middle of the softbox, in this case an octabank, is pretty much smack dab center to our model. All right, but as we move to the middle image, you can see that the quality of light gets much softer and the contrast becomes less. So what we've done here is I've moved the entire modifier, the entire octabank, closer to camera position. And I've positioned it so that the back edge of the octabank is just by my model's leg. Okay, so I'm working with the edge of the modifier, and I'm using the light that is coming out of the back of the modifier, and that is feathered light, hence the name feathering. All right, and you can see here that it creates a much softer, more pleasing effect. And on the right, we have the final image with post-processing. So I added a little bit of contrast back, and that's going to be, you're going to season to taste as you like. But if you're looking for soft lighting and you're looking for pleasing, flattering lighting, feathering is definitely a go-to technique. So if you're not feathering, check it out. Number 4 is using too much flash. I think this is something that a lot of people new to flash can end up doing. So I wanted to show you the way that I think about strobe and the way that I think about flash. I like to be very judicious in the way that I use flash, and my whole way of thinking about flash is that you really want to focus on where you put the light. A lot of people, when they're starting out with flash, you end up putting light everywhere, right? And that's fine, but I think more interesting light is when you control it and you are really specific in where you put it, okay? And that's why I included these two pictures here, because here we're using the absence of light really creates what's interesting in these pictures rather than an abundance of light. So when you're thinking about flash, remember that a lot of light can work, but also a very little light can work and be very interesting. Some of the tools that will help you to control your light and really create very interesting and specific areas of light are tools like a Fresnel, zoom spot, grids like egg crate grids and grid spots for reflectors, and snoots. A snoot is a conical kind of lighting modifier that will create a little circle of light. So you've got lots of different options when it comes to the way that you shape and control your light. So be careful with how much light you're throwing at your subjects. Less is more. Number 5 is having too much fall off happening with your lighting. Okay, so what does that mean? Here's a perfect example. And you can see in this full figure shot, and I'm talking specifically about lighting full figure images, okay? So if you look at this image, we have fairly even lighting from top to bottom. And when you have too much fall off, you don't have that. What happens is the face and torso will be fairly brightly lit, but as you move down toward the feet, the pants, the midsection and below can fall into darkness, and that is fall off, because what happens is when you use a light modifier, for example, like a beauty dish like I'm using here, you have a circle of light that will illuminate the face and part of the chest, and then that light starts to fall off, and everything outside of that circle of light starts to become darker and darker. So how do you work around that? How do you create even lighting for an entire figure? Well, that's what we're doing here. So I've included a lighting diagram to show you basically what you want to do, and this is a great way to light the entire figure, is to stack two lights one on top of another. Okay, so I'm using a beauty dish as my key light, and then below that I have a 14 by 35 Ellen Chrome softbox, strip box, and that is a nice vertical shape, so it matches the shape of the figure, and it also illuminates the entire lower portion of the figure. So the beauty dish is giving me that quality of light, which is a kind of specular quality of light that's perfect for fashion, and the softbox is giving me nice soft light for the clothing, right? So together they create a nice evenly lit image from top to bottom. So a great way to do that. So it's a way for you to avoid fall off, and that's definitely something that can be a kind of a gotcha. So you can see here that I've got my key light and my fill light, we'll call it a fill light, over on camera left, and then a fill card over on camera right. So I taught this to my friend Keith, and he calls it the woofer and tweeter, which I really like. So anyway, that's a way to avoid too much fall off. Number 6 is not having enough direction to your lighting. Now what that means is the angle, the direction that you give your strobe in relationship to your subject, okay? So what you want to imagine is an imaginary circle around your subjects, okay? And as you move your light from the 12 o'clock position, left or right, around that circle, you are going to introduce more shadow. And shadow is your friend, and that's something that I think it takes time for people who are just starting out with strobe. It takes time for them to understand that shadow is not a bad thing necessarily. I think a lot of people, when they're first starting out, they think everything should be flatly lit, evenly lit, and that shadow kind of intimidates them. But but as you can see here, shadow is definitely a good thing. It creates drama and a sense of dimension and a sense of volume. And it definitely makes your pictures more interesting. So experiment with that. Right here on the image on the left, we've got our key light coming in from camera left, and that is creating shadows on the camera right side of the face. We've got a fill card on that side of the face as well to bounce a little bit of light back in and open up some of the shadows so that it's not pitch black, but we still have some information there. The image on the right, I'm using an umbrella overhead for some top light, and that is also creating shadows. So two different ways to do it, but we're still working with shadow. Our light is not flat and it's not boring. It creates a very interesting look to the lighting. Okay, so if you're not experimenting with a different direction for your lights, try it, because I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Number 7 on our list of top 10 lighting mistakes is relying solely on TTL, or said another way, fear of manual. All right, so I've included this because I wanted to let you know that while TTL is great, in some instances, because TTL is using something that we call reflective metering, it can be tripped up by images like this. Like when you have white on black and black on white, the meter doesn't really know what can happen, and so it doesn't know what to do. So sometimes you'll have an underexposed image if it reads for the white, or if it reads for the black, you'll have an overexposed image, etc. So it will wreak havoc on your exposures, okay? Because what's happening is reflective meter reading is reading the light that is reflected, as its name would imply, from whatever is in front of the camera, okay? In this case, you've got black and you've got white, and the meter doesn't really know which one it should be metering in some instances. In some instances, it'll work fine. But if you find yourself in a situation where your images are overexposed or underexposed and you don't know what's going on, the likelihood is that its TTL is not working for you. So all that you need to do is just switch over to manual. And I know that people can be intimidated by manual, but I guarantee you it is one of the most simple ways to meter. Basically, all that it is less light or more light. So do you want quarter power? Do you want full power? Do you want 16th power, etc.? So, and then if you're working with ambient and flash together, you're going to use flash power in conjunction with aperture to control the contribution of your flash, and you'll work with your shutter speed to control the contribution of the ambient light. It's really that simple, okay? We're going to talk about metering a little bit when we get into handheld meters, but that you can work intuitively if you don't have a handheld meter, but I'm going to encourage you to get a handheld meter as well, and we'll talk more about that in an upcoming tip. Number 8 is not using a handheld flash meter. Okay, guys, if you're working with flash, you owe it to yourself to learn how to use a handheld flash meter and to always have one with you in your bag. Now, you might not always use it, but when you need it, it's a lifesaver, okay? So let's talk about what you can do with a handheld flash meter that you cannot do with your camera's built-in meter. First of all, your in-camera meter cannot meter manual flash, okay? It can only meter TTL flash. And the reason for that is with manual flash, when you make an exposure, the mirror on your camera will go up, and therefore the meter is now blocked and the flash is popping, so there is no way for you to take a meter reading. Now, as we discussed in the previous tip, reflective readings are not the most accurate readings because they are reading the light that is reflected off of whatever you're photographing. And if that's black fabric, the amount of light reflected is going to be very different than white fabric or whatever surface you're photographing. They can have different amounts of reflectivity, so that will affect your exposure. With a handheld meter, you have the option to do incident light readings, and that is incident meter readings, and that is more often than not how I use my meter. What an incident reading does is it allows you to read the light falling on a subject, so it is always accurate. That never changes. It's not subject to the vagaries of how much light is reflecting or not reflecting, how much light is being absorbed by different, black fabric versus white fabric. So that's one of the things that really makes a handheld light meter stand out. It's the only way that you can meter manual flash. And as you know, I'm a big proponent of manual exposure for flash. It also will allow you to work extremely quickly. Basically, when you take a meter reading, and you have your light set up properly, you know that the first exposure that you make is going to be spot on and correct. So it saves you a ton of time. There's no chimping involved. You set your meter, you get your exposure, you're ready to go. First exposure, you're on track. Okay, that's number one. It also allows you to be really consistent. You can replicate the same shots anywhere that you go, anytime. If you have lighting patterns that you like to do, it will allow you to create ratios between a key light and an accent light. For example, and I know that that term ratios can be really intimidating to people, but it's really as simple as this. Let's say your key light is at f16 and you want your accent light at f8. Well, that's -1 stop. So using a handheld light meter, you can quickly determine the differences between your lights. Then when you go and you want to do that technique, that look again, you know exactly what you need to do. You set up your lights, you meter one light at f16, that's your key light, you meter your accent light at f8, and you're good to go. Okay, now you can't do that without a handheld meter. So, another thing that you can do with a handheld meter, if you're working with ambient and flash, and you want to determine the amount of flash that is being contributed to the exposure, you can actually get a percentage reading using a handheld light meter. The meter will tell you what percentage of light is coming from the flash, and typically for a nice even balance between ambient and flash, you want about 20% contributed from the flash, and that's going to give you a very natural looking balance. If you want something more flashy, then you're going to have more, but you'll get to know those percentages as you work with it. But it's a really great method for determining the amount of flash for that light that you want contributed to an exposure. All right, so in short, if you're not using a handheld light meter, I really encourage you to invest in one and learn how to use it. It is an awesome tool. Number 9 in our list of top 10 lighting mistakes, and this is one that I have to continuously remind myself of, is knowing when to turn your flash off as well as knowing when to turn your flash on. So it says here, not knowing when to turn your flash off. Yeah, when you start to use flash on a regular basis, it can become really easy to forget that you don't always need flash. Okay, so case in point, this image here. I could have easily made this image with flash, but I really didn't need to because I had sunlight over the left shoulder of our model, and I was able to use a reflector, and that created beautiful light simply and easily and quickly. So, you know, flash, as great as it is, it does add a layer of complexity that sometimes you don't need. So, you know, don't always think that you need flash. Just because you have one in your bag doesn't mean that you always need to use one. Again, it goes to being deliberate and to thinking, you know, about to having an idea going in of what kind of effect, what kind of lighting you want to create. And sometimes you'll need flash, and sometimes you won't. We're going to look at something next, and you'll see, you know, what the differences are between, you know, using flash and not using flash. But you don't always need to use flash. So if you are someone who's using flash all the time and you're watching this, I know that from time to time I need to assess the situation and remind myself, hey, you know, this lighting is really good. I can accomplish what I need, what I set out to do without using flash, so there's no need for me to take it out of my bag. I can get by with a reflector or a scrim or both, and I'll be fine. Number 10, and the biggest mistake that you can make with flash, is not using flash or strobe, not using artificial light. Okay guys, this goes out to all of the quote-unquote available light shooters out there. I love to joke. I wrote an entire article about this last month. I love to pick up a strobe and say, guys, you see this? This is an available light, okay? So this slide is all about showing you, and again, I wrote an entire article on this, so if this piques your interest, definitely go and check it out. But on the left, you can see here we've got an available light shot, okay? Well, ambient light shot, just using the light that was available to us on set, on scene in the alley, okay? No flash. On the right, we have what happens when we introduce strobe. So when we mix strobe and ambient together, okay? So the point of this, and the whole point, and why I'm so passionate about this particular subject, is what flash allows you to do is to make your own decisions. It allows you to, it frees you from being held hostage by whatever the ambient conditions are in a situation, okay? So for example, on the left, we have perfectly acceptable light, but it's not exactly the light that I would want to use to create a professional commercial looking image that would be suited for editorial or for sale, for a senior portrait, etc. I would want to do something that was more in line with what's going on the right when we have flash introduced. So absent flash, I would not have been able to create that image. And this was shot by Stell Nestor, by the way, at one of my workshops. So a big shout out to her. But you can see here the difference. So we've got available light, quote unquote, on the left, and then we've got flash and ambient together on the right. Very different looks, and you cannot do one without the other, okay? So if you're not using artificial light, I really encourage you to go out, get yourself a strobe, get yourself a handheld flash, and just have fun with it. Don't be intimidated by it. Just swing for the fences. Don't be afraid to fail. Go back, check out all my tutorials. There's a ton of great stuff here on BehindTheShutter.com that you can, get you up to speed on using strobe. All right, so that's going to wrap it up for this month. I hope you've enjoyed these top 10 lighting mistakes, learned a few things along the way, and I will see you next month here at BehindTheShutter.com.